Titanic lies close to 4 kilometres, over 12,000 feet deep at the bottom of the North Atlantic, and she's in bad shape. Debris is everywhere. The stern section is unrecognisable as anything other than a 15,000-tonne pile of torn metal, and that debris field extends for miles and miles. It's a haunting and tragic sight. Every piece tells a story of the ship and the many people who brought it into being, or who travelled and died aboard. Since the rediscovery of the wreck, one company, RMS Titanic Inc, has maintained the title of Salvor in Possession, allowing them to visit the site and retrieve artefacts for preservation, and most importantly of all, public display and education. Last year, I got my chance to visit and meet Tomasina Ray, RMST's president and a long-time curator of the artefacts collection. So far in this series, we've looked together at some of the luxurious fittings and pieces from the ship's engine room and navigational equipment, but today we look at 2 items that are far more personal, and we start with one of the most unlikely items to have survived at all.
So now we have sheet music from recovered from a passenger's belongings, and actually Irwin wasn't a passenger. Irwin had his trunk with one of the passengers. He had departed earlier, and his trunk was with Henry Hall, who was on Titanic.
Hall was 25 years old in 1912. Photos show a long-haired and handsome dandy, one of 5 kids originally from Middlesex in England, called Harry by his friends and family. That family had sailed to New York aboard the SS Paris back in 1895 when Henry was just 9. They settled in Buffalo, where the young man eventually became an upholsterer working on carriages and cars. At his work, he met a young Canadian, Howard Irwin, and the two became good friends. They shared a passion for music and a deep desire to travel. In 1910, the pair set out to tour the world together, and they would work along the way to afford it. Irwin wrote in his diary, "On January 1st, Harry Hall and myself started on a trip around the world, working our way, stopping in all the principalities between Buffalo and Frisco, from there to Australia, then through the Suez Canal and Mediterranean Sea to England. From there to New York and Buffalo, we figure. With luck, this trip will take us 2 years. And with bad luck, well, we're going anyway." In Sydney, Hall met a young woman and he fell in love, and he intended to move back there to marry her. He and his mate Irwin eventually made it to England on the final leg of the trip, but for reasons unknown, only Henry boarded Titanic at Southampton that day and carried with him some of Irwin's luggage.
In Irwin's trunk, he had about 20 pieces of sheet music because he was a clarinetist and he played the clarinet. So this is one of the pieces of sheet music. And I'm not a huge music of 1912 knower. I don't know a ton about music from 1912.
Don't worry, Tomasina, we won't hold it against you. This is a pretty obscure bit of music, but it just so happens that Edwardian and 1920s music is one of my favourite topics. Winter is a song that's basically forgotten about today, but I guarantee you, those of you watching at home will probably know its lyricist. But first, I bet you're dying to hear what it actually sounded like. Here's YouTuber and pianist Yen Yen S giving us a glimpse at a song not heard very much since 1910. People's relationship with music back in 1912 was different to the way that we interact with it today. For all of human history, the only way to actually enjoy music was to hear somebody else playing it or to make it yourself. Recording technology was still in its infancy. In fact, the battle between cylinder and disc was kind of still playing out. although Thomas Edison's strict adherence to classical and religious music had ensured that his cylinder would eventually lose the fight. Novelty and parlour songs had become hugely popular in the 1800s, and the fun carried over into the Edwardian age. Only now, artists had the ability to actually record their music onto shellac 78 records and sell them across the globe. Music hall favourites and operatic stars alike could thrill audiences far and away. It was just another marvel in that era of technological miracles. Already by 1912, recording artists had started on that would become household names. Just 4 months before Titanic sailed, Al Jolson made his first recording with Victor Records. Jolson would go on to star in the first big talking picture and make records all the way through the Jazz Age up to his death in 1950. But recorded music was only a tiny part of a much bigger industry that still prioritised sheet music sales and live performance. This was the birth of the era of pop music, and songs like Let Me Call You Sweetheart and It's a Long Way to Tipperary would go on to sell 5, 6, 7 million or more copies of sheet music alone. Travelling musicians could make a buck playing for cafes and restaurants. Virtually every home had a piano and somebody who could play it. Shellac 78 records were, meanwhile, surprisingly expensive for the time. A single record could cost £1, that's about £102 today, $136 US. But by contrast, a corner 5 and dime store would sell sheet music in the US for just 10 cents, about $3.30 today, or just over £2. It was big business, and until the vinyl record became king in the early 20s and beyond, it was printed sheet music like this, which was the primary way popular songs were spread. And absolutely dominating the entire music world was Tin Pan Alley, a group of New York music publishers responsible for most of the popular songs of the 1910s we remember to this day. One of Tin Pan Alley's shining stars was the author of Winter's lyrics, Alfred Bryan, a Canadian. He wrote Winter in 1910, but you probably know his other hit from the same year. With his lyrics put to music by Fred Fisher, Bryan wrote a song that was a smash hit in 1910 and for some time afterward, and which would burst onto the pop culture scene again some 87 years later. That song? Come Josephine in My Flying Machine.
Come Josephine in my flying machine, going up she goes. Balance yourself like a bird on a beam in the air she goes. Where? There she goes. Up she goes, it's higher. Ooh, my, the food is on fire. Come Josephine in my flying machine, going up, all on, goodbye.
The best known recording of that song, heard here, was made by Etta Jones and Billy Murray. Murray was, far and away, the most prolific recording artist of the 1910s. Remember when I mentioned how expensive records were back then? Well, Murray sold over 300 million of them. He sang just about everything, and fortunately that includes Alfred Bryan's Winter. In New York, August 1911, Murray made this recording.
Softly falling, that's the time to squeeze when it starts to freeze. In October and November and December, just remember winter, when your sweetheart comes a-calling. By the fireside so bright, you'll sit and tease her. That's the time to squeeze her when it's winter.
The cover of this is really beautiful, and it's obviously an amazing period piece, and the illustration is just so adorable, and still have it this legible after decades under the ocean is very cool.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a minute. So, where was this found, and how has it stayed in this? I mean, I've seen worse sheet music in worse condition in
like
thrift stores.
Yeah, like an estate sale or something. Yeah, so this would have been in a trunk, in a leather trunk, something that was, leather is cured with chemicals that protected both the leather and the things inside of the leather, or the organic things inside the leather in particular. So paper, textiles inside of leather containers survived really well intact, and we're very fortunate to have those because oftentimes that's where the names of the passenger who owned that thing are written down somewhere. So in this case, actually, you can just see here the name, the end of the name Irwin, because this is Howard Irwin's sheet music, and he labeled all of his sheet music with his name so that he could keep track of it, because he was traveling with his friend who was also a musician. So I'm sure they were like, no, that's mine, that's mine. And so this was his, and we can actually turn it over if you'd like. But actually, so this piece of paper is to help with the conservation, but we can take it out of the Mylar cover, which is what we have it in for, just safe handling. So these Mylar sleeves are really important for handling and for transport. And the spine is separated from this, so we'll leave it over there so that it doesn't come loose or get damaged. But there's the front. Let's see what the back looks like.
Now, before any of you get too upset about us handling this sheet with our bare hands, Tomasina has something to say about modern thinking around taking care of historic documents, just like this.
So for a long time in museums, you'd see people wearing like the white cotton gloves all the time, and that's really just never been a safe way to handle things, because you don't have that tactile sensation when you're touching, or that good grip. They're a little slippy. So we, as a profession, moved more towards nitrile gloves. And that works really well for metals or ceramics and glass, where you're worried about getting the oils from your hands and leaving a residue or a fingerprint. But with paper, because they are so delicate, and being able to feel and separate the pages is so much more important, we've come all the way around to bare, clean hands is actually the best practice for working with these now.
Amazing.
So it took people a while, and people still get a little like, oh, you're touching something with your bare hands. But it really is the safest way, because without doing that, you're not really understanding what you're touching, and you could accidentally tear or pull something off that would not be good. So I think this is probably an advertisement, looks like an advertisement for the publisher's other music publications. Some of these titles are just so funny now, looking back at them. I'd like to tell you your fortune, dearie.
Macaroni Joe. I want to know what Macaroni Joe is about.
Oh!
Macaroni Joe is just one of those novelty songs that's so ridiculous to us today you can't help but laugh. But it does hint at a darker side to entertainment of the time. Of course, Titanic cannot be divorced from the context of the world in which she existed. Many Tin Pan Alley songs were aimed to draw cheap laughs by taking pot shots at easy targets, mostly African Americans, women, and the millions of migrants coming into Ellis Island from all across Europe. The lyrics were often crass. Macaroni Joe is a perfect example of the kind of groan-inducing racial stereotype you come upon if you delve into Edwardian music. Not only that, but it was a cutthroat industry. Lyricists and composers certainly weren't making their fortunes, but the publishing companies sure were. This was long before the royalty system since put into place to protect creators of music from predatory publishers. Take, for example, Scott Joplin. You may have heard of him. He was one of America's greatest composers, a man whose music almost characterized the entire decade of 1900 through 1910. In 1897, Joplin wrote the single best-selling piece of ragtime music of the age, the Maple Leaf Rag, but he only made 1% on sales, an annual income somewhere around $17,000 in today's money. Eventually, he died in poverty, aged just 48. It would be many years before this kind of exploitative practice could be discouraged. But for travelling musicians like Suit Hall and Irwin, the sheet music being pumped out by publishing companies was a lifeline, and it was a way to make money on the side. It's incredible that this piece of sheet music still exists today, having stayed intact despite remaining on the bottom of the ocean for more than 80 years.
Work gets done on everything. So the paper artifacts in particular, you have to clean them off, get rid of there's always debris, there's always a little sediment or something stuck to things. So you want to clean off anything that could scratch or harm the artifact, and then they'll also be desalinated. And paper in particular is going to be susceptible to things like mold. So keeping these in a slightly drier climate so that it doesn't encourage mold growth, in a cooler climate so it doesn't encourage mold growth is important as well. But you can see staining a lot of times. If there was a metal object near it, it might leave like a little rust stain. Or up here, we can see a little bit of pattern. And I think that's probably transfer from another piece of sheet music that would have been stacked with this. So the image came off and they'll leave a ghost image in its place. And then you can see also, again, we've numbered this down here. So this was recovered in 1993. The sheet music all has a number of 0321. And this is the 19th piece of sheet music out of 22 that he had in his possession.
Wow. So they've all been preserved, just like this one.
They've all been preserved, and they all have these amazing Art Deco-ish kind of artworks and covers, which are so much fun to look at and just so sweet.
Harry Soothall had boarded Titanic alone, carrying his friend's luggage after 2 years and 4 months away from home. It had been an incredible experience. Soothall had even played violin as part of an interview and an audition with none other than John Philip Sousa, who had been impressed with the young man's abilities. Unlike dozens of others, though, his passage aboard Titanic was not a stroke of fate owing to the coal strike crippling Britain's shipping. He had specifically waited to book aboard the newest and grandest liner in the world, and he bragged about it to friends and family back home in America. He was popular among his own set, Irwin later wrote of his friend. He was quiet, honest, unassuming, and upright. He did not drink, smoke, swear, or cast an evil eye upon the beautiful young ladies that crossed his path. Henry Soothall boarded Titanic with third-class ticket 392076, and he stepped into the pages of history. When Titanic sank, he was lost with the ship, and his body was never recovered or identified. Then, on the bottom of the North Atlantic Ocean, one of Henry's suitcases was found completely intact, with his friend's sheet music still inside. You know, we think of Titanic, we think of the band. It's impossible because of the film not to think of the music. Yeah. I mean, what does finding something like this, in this degree of condition, mean to you as a person who's artifact-driven and history-driven?
You know, it's a way to actually hear what they would have been listening to on Titanic, the popular music of the day. We know the White Star Line songbook is obviously out there and available if you want to find out what it is, but this is more of just what common people would have been listening to or was popular or what this particular person was interested in, which I think is the great thing about having these personal effects from some of the passengers is we learn a little bit more about them specifically and not just here's the Edwardian period in general. Here's what this person in the Edwardian period was interested in or liked, or so that's what I love about these pieces in particular.
In 110 years' time, when people find our Spotify playlists,
it's gonna be so embarrassing.
Macaroni Joe.
That's the time to freeze away this winter.
Some more paper objects survived Titanic's sinking and all those years afterward, and we'll cover another fascinating example in a future episode. But next, Tomasina showed me something a little more sparkly.
This one is actually one of my favorite artifacts. I think it is my favorite piece of jewelry that we've recovered from Titanic. And so this little one is what we call the sapphire ring, and we can see why. It's beautiful sapphire surrounded in diamonds, and it's just so delicate and beautiful to have survived on the ocean floor.
It's hard to imagine an item more personal and precious to the owner than jewelry. It can tell a lot about your personality. Up in first class, Titanic was carrying a lot of jewelry. At dinner, the women would dress in their finest and newest fashions from Paris, their décolletage glittering with diamonds, rubies, and sapphires, their hair adorned with sparkling tiaras. Much of the jewelry was kept by its owner during the voyage, stored in small safes or in lockboxes in their staterooms. But still more jewelry was actually lost with Titanic, and it resulted in some pretty big insurance claims. Take, for example, Madeline Astor. It's hard to know exactly how much her jewels were worth. Some stated they were priceless, but there are some things we do know. We know that her diamond solitaire engagement ring was supposedly $25,000, that's nearly $790,000 today. She had a $250,000 pearl necklace and a gilded menagerie of sapphires, rubies, and diamonds. So it's safe to assume that those lost in the sinking of the Titanic would have been worth an extremely large sum. The only thing is, we don't know what was saved and what was lost. Even in her mourning, after her husband had been lost in the sinking, Madeline wore some of the jewellery he had given her, including a diamond-encrusted choker and pearls. Then there was Ida Strauss and her husband Isidore. The couple had been travelling in Europe and were returning to America aboard Titanic. They'd brought with them many valuable belongings, including Ida's jewellery. Both Ida and Isidore were lost when Titanic sank, as they famously refused to be separated from one another. And with them went everything they'd brought aboard the ship. The value of these items, adjusted for inflation, would be hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money. What was lost on Titanic, we don't know. What we do know is it all almost survived. Ida handed all of it to her personal maid, who had got into a lifeboat, but then she took it back off her. When the time came for the Strausses to board the lifeboats themselves, Ida famously refused to leave her husband behind. "Where you go, I go," she had said, and the two were last seen embracing side by side on a bench. So, given the scale of the disaster, the survival and recovery of this tiny piece of jewellery is particularly notable. Because not all of the jewellery aboard Titanic was kept by its owner, much of it was instead handed over to the purser's office for safekeeping.
The only reason we're able to find something like this is because it was in a bag. It was in a bag that would have been recovered and protected it. The bag that this was found in particular looks kind of like a doctor's bag. If you've seen like the traditional brown leather bag with the handle that doctors in cartoons rush in with. Mm-hmm. So we refer to it as the Gladstone bag, and it contained the belongings of several passengers that had been put in it together, probably by the ship's purser as the ship was sinking, cleared out some of the safes of the items that they were holding on to for the passengers during the voyage, and put it in this Gladstone bag to get back to the passengers, hopefully when they got to New York. But this bag didn't make it off the ship. And so when we found it, and it had all of these precious items from the passengers, it was an amazing discovery.
Titanic's first-class pursers were Hugh McElroy and Reginald Barker. Their day-to-day was spent ensuring all first-class passengers' needs were met, to answer queries, make bookings on the swimming pool, the squash court and the Turkish bath, to organise the renting of deck chairs, the outgoing wireless messages and communiques ashore. But they also oversaw administration matters aboard the ship, most crucially of all, the pay, completed when docked in port. How this leather bag, full of jewellery, made its way off the ship paints a tragic picture of Titanic's final moments. The purser's office is still intact in the wreck, meaning its contents didn't spill out during the breakup and the sinking. Somebody had to have cleared the safe and taken the bag with them. Hugh McElroy's movements on the night of the sinking are fairly well documented because he was a popular member of the crew among passengers and a very familiar face. A final sighting right at the end has McElroy up on the boat deck desperately trying to help free and release one of the collapsible boats. His body was found days later with a set of keys still in his pocket, but the movements of Reginald Barker are far less well known. It seems most likely that Barker, towards the end of the sinking, had cleared the safe and dumped all the envelopes containing passengers' jewellery into a big leather case. But, of course, Barker didn't survive, and his body was never found. Instead, that case was rediscovered on the ocean floor.
So the purser was probably trying to do their duty and get these things to a lifeboat, just didn't make it. And I don't think there's any record of a purser's bag making it onto one of the lifeboats, to my knowledge.
So attaching this ring to an owner sounds like an impossible task. Did passenger claims ever go into enough detail to suggest, like, you know, it would be so convenient to pull out, circular diamond ring with central sapphire?
I wish That's actually funny because we just went to the National Archives and went and took some copies of a bunch of the insurance claims, but so many people just wrote gold watch, diamond ring, and it's so frustrating because we want to be able to go through and maybe identify whose things they were, but I think everybody on Titanic said they lost a gold chain. That might be the most common thing we saw, and we're like, well, that doesn't help us identify your object, and I'm so sorry.
How are you guys going about trying to figure out who this might have belonged to?
So the nice thing is that the purser would have had these items labeled for the different passengers that they needed to go back to, and the passengers would have often had like a claim ticket that they could use to get their item. So for the things that were in the Gladstone bag, the items would have been in envelopes, and the envelopes were signed by the passenger as well so that they could claim their item. Unfortunately, the paper had deteriorated a little bit and the signatures had washed away, so we weren't able to read them when we first recovered this in 1987 on our first expedition. But over time, technology has changed and it's gotten so much better that we're able to use multispectral imaging to read the things that we can't see with our naked eye. The pen or the pencil that the passengers would have used to sign their name would leave little traces on the paper, and using different spectrums of light pointed at that and taking a photo under each spectrum of light will allow us to figure out which one causes the remaining ink to fluoresce, and then allow us to read whatever is there for the first time. So that is one of the projects we're currently working on, and we're very excited about it, is being able to identify the passengers whose items were in this bag and then hopefully reassign the artifacts directly to those passengers.
It's the personal nature of these artifacts that makes them so touching. These were once treasured. They were so important to their owners that they were entrusted to the care of the Titanic's pursers, and yet they were lost to the ocean, even as one of the pursers died doing his duty, his very best, to save them. It's not just because of their monetary value. These rings would have been gifts, family heirlooms, engagement promises. Their owners are now long gone, but there, in this room full of bent, twisted metal, shattered glass and crockery, fragments of smashed windows, and the relics of a destroyed ocean liner, are personal items that look exactly the same today as they did 114 years ago.
So the gold, the silver, the platinum does not gold, obviously silver will tarnish over time, but gold and platinum, this is just, it's absolutely, it's still gold. It's beautiful, and it doesn't rust or corrode like so many of the other things that sank with Titanic did. So I think that that's, when they say diamonds are forever or jewelry is timeless, they kind of mean it in a sense.
This is what they had in mind. It reminds me of like when they brought up the perfume, which still smelled of perfume. Shocking, I know, but
it is shocking. I think it takes so many people by surprise. They don't know what they're going to recover, what's still intact, and what survives underwater. And the perfume did so well because it's an oil, so it didn't mix with the water necessarily, and it sealed itself in its little vial, and amazingly still smelled.
A huge amount of work has gone into stabilizing these things. They can't just be brought up and put on display. If they're going to last even minutes outside of the watery environment they've been home to for all these decades, they will need to be looked after. When those perfume vials were brought up and they smelled sweet and flowery, it shocked researchers because most of the things pulled up from the Titanic wreck site have an alien smell of decay and rot that's very hard to shake.
I've heard that things freshly brought up have this horrendous smell. Is that true? What's that about?
That, I think, is about the rust and that decomposition smell. There can be, we do have mud samples and some rustical samples, and they do have a particularly metallic decomposition-y smell to them. And it just kind of, I think, you even mentioned when we walked into this room, like, what is that smell? And it is the smell of the decomposition that had happened, and that just kind of doesn't quite go away. And especially because even in this room, we do store some of those samples. So it just fills the space.
When somebody like me thinks of Titanic, we often picture the rivets, the steel, the engines. But of course, Titanic's is a human story, and it's the personal artifacts that tell it best of all. The sheet music, one of the few relics of a 114-year-old friendship now lost to time, an engagement ring once given in a moment of tender passion. There are countless numbers of these things still down there in the abyss where they were never meant to be.
I mean, Titanic means something different to everybody. The people have their different ends to it, and they have different points of fascination. The things in the Gladstone bag, the beautiful pieces of jewelry like this was really important to someone. You had to entrust it to the purser during the journey so that you felt it was safe. And whoever owned this would have been very precious to them. So, we're conserving and preserving and safekeeping the thing that they entrusted to the Titanic's purser. And I think that that's important to carrying on the mission and that person's, what their wishes had been.
Next time we join Tomasina and the RMS Titanic Inc. artifacts collection, we'll examine the remnants of some fine Titanic china, the plates that the richest people aboard would have happily eaten from. We'll look at some of the wine bottles which still have their corks in them, and some other fascinating pieces of the ship's kitchens, so long under the ocean surface, they've fused together. Join us as the artifacts themselves speak of culinary life aboard Titanic, and what it was like to eat aboard the finest ship at sea.